Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, Greg Anthony here. I'm glad you're back on the Investigative Journal on this May 4th, 2017 day on our calendar. And we've been talking about the Jesuit War Manual, Sun Tzu's Art of War, the fact that they may have even written it. And you can go back to some of my shows this week and one last week to get a lot of that. We've been also calling upon Walter Veith and some information he's presenting, and I'll try to get to that in the second half hour. But first I want to follow up on what I did yesterday. I talked yesterday about the manufacturing of Mozart, the myth of Mozart, and how he wasn't the child prodigy we were told, according to Robert Newman and other musicologists studying this in England. And I posed the question, did Robert finish his book that I talked about in 2009, I believe? And I checked it out, and he did. You can get it at musicalrevisionism.info and read more about Robert and this very, very intriguing story. The 200-year-old legend of Mozart, he says, is contradicted by a massive amount of evidence. But of equal importance are glaring gaps in the official story. Where did Mozart learn his composition? What role did the Jesuit order, the elites of the Holy Roman Empire, and those of the British Empire play in manufacturing the legendary career of W.A. Mozart? The answer, he says, is massive, and he'll give you some reasons why they do it. And also, he wanted to give credit to Luca Bianchini, Anna Trombetta, and Agostino Tabogo of Italy, who did some remarkable musical research and found out that Mozart didn't write La Nozze di Figaro. That was done in 1786. So those Jesuits up to their sneaky ways again. And before we get to the Art of War and their war manual, which really underlines a lot of what they do, and it's amazing to me that all of these things get out in the open, but they never trace back to the real perpetrators. And terrorism is a good example. How can you wake up every day today without thinking about it? They've got it ingrained in your mind that these radical Muslims are going to take over Western civilization. And perhaps they are radical, and if you look at Islam and read the Quran, that's correct. But who created this? Who basically orchestrates and manufactures terrorism? That's the real question. And those answers you'll never get on the mainstream media because they cover and they work for the enemy within. So it's important that we understand where terrorism comes from today. And I've tried to do my best because it's not very easy when you're working up against a multi-billion-dollar organization, a media organization, and also the secretive works of these secret societies and the Freemasons and the Jesuits. But they do make mistakes, and I try to pick up on those mistakes and use it as circumstantial evidence to show that, yes, they created ISIS, and also are very sympathetic to Islam. Two priests you need to look at are, during this period of time, are Father Dal Oglio, who's in Syria. His story is incredible and his connections. I think he's basically there as an overseer. And also we look at Father Thomas Michel, both Jesuits, and his christening of the word Chrislam and their connection to Islam and how they're trying to, bring together everyone under the umbrella of the Antichrist Roman Empire Vatican system. So we try to do that. Now, when we look at terrorism, back in the 80s in the United States, I wasn't here. And no one was talking about terrorism when I left for Italy in 1980. in America. And in fact, when I got to Italy, I didn't understand what it was until I was living under terrorism. Yes, there were groups in Italy in the 80s, and in fact, the Jesuits and the USA and the CIA were practicing terrorism there, honing their skills, and they were creating all of these left and right-wing radical groups who were fighting American imperialism, fighting the Christian Democratic Italian Party, etc., etc. And bombs were blazing all over the place. The Bologna bombing. There were numerous bombings in Rome when I was there. You'd be driving, if you go out to the countryside, there were terrorist blockades where you had to stop your car, show your IDs, and move forward. One of the big groups was the Brigata Rossa. And when you started tracing where the money came from, it always seemed to come from the West. And the CIA, along with the Jesuits, were involved in this. And how do I know that? Well, the best way to figure it out is to be in a terrorist attack, to be a victim. And luckily, I wasn't killed, but I was about 10 seconds away from meeting my maker back in what was it? I can't even remember. There's a story still on the web. If you go to UPI, Rome, bombing American newspaper, you'll see my name there. And to make a long story short, they put a bomb in the newspaper, and it would have blown me sky high, but I was about 10 seconds away down in the basement in the newsroom when it blew out the hallway I walked through. And so that made me kind of curious, and I started to think, how did they get into this place? I mean, it had to be an inside job, and it just happened to coincide with the first visit to Italy of Ronald Reagan. And it didn't take long before I didn't even know the name of the terrorist group, claimed responsibility, saying this was a message to the hangman Reagan. Well, why didn't they try to blow up his car? I mean, I had nothing to do with Reagan. In fact, the irony of the whole story is that I left America because I didn't like Ronald Reagan. And then he has to come to Rome and almost get me killed. Now, is that fair? But that's the way these guys operate, you know? And so as I became interested, and it isn't easy to find the information, because the story that I was almost blown up was covered it was on like page 25 of the New York Times or something. And I tried to make a big deal about it because I was almost killed. And guess what? What my editor said. And not at the newspaper, but at the AP and UPI, where I was doing freelance stories. He said, well, Greg, if you were killed, probably all the newspapers would pick it up. But, since it's just a close call, these things are going on here every day. But when I found out then, I started really looking into how much they were covering this overseas. And you weren't hearing that much in the States. These people, then I started looking at the connections, the hidden stories that I was finding out through Italian journalists who'd been more wary of the Vatican and the Jesuits for a lot more than I had, started filling me in on stories and connections and people. And it became very obvious to me that the CIA was involved as well. And also tracing the American newspaper at the time, which is now just an online paper, not owned by the same people, was funded by covert money through the CIA. So it was actually a CIA propaganda outlet. I had no idea when I got there. But I learned a lot. And so it made me understand that terrorism was orchestrated. And we have to really get to the bottom of it if we ever want to understand it. And that's really where people go wrong today. They don't want to go deep enough. They don't want to follow the money. And when you do, just like Robert Newman did in the story about Mozart, tracing it back to the Jesuit order, you can do the same with terrorism. So, where's a good starting point? What I thought to do was, since we're on the subject, and instead of talking about ISIS today, we've done that in the past, And there's a connection even with the name to paganism and to Egyptian goddesses, and also the phallic symbols that are in Rome, Washington, and London, the obelisks. And that was ISIS worshiping. Okay? So, it's very, very, they're telling us what they're doing. Except people don't have eyes and ears to see. And those eyes and ears will open up if you start researching, and also, read prophecy in the Bible. And I started out, from the secular point of view. And then I started piecing together things in the Bible. And it always seemed, what was amazing to me is that they all matched up. So I recommend you mold both of those two together, and you'll get some really good answers. And your eyes and ears will open up. But anyway, instead of talking about ISIS today, I thought we'd go back to 1605 to show you. The Jesuits were formed in the mid to late 1500s. And that was to basically stop the Protestant Reformation and the protest against Rome so that the Rome could keep its power. Well, the Jesuits have been busy orchestrating terror ever since 1605. And a good way to start, and I got a little clip today, and we're going to hear some English accents and a little history about the gunpowder plot. Now, the gunpowder plot, very simply, was in Guy Fawkes is always remembered as being the culprit, but there's much, much more. Just like it's very similar to when you ask most people and you say, who killed Lincoln? All they're going to talk about is John Wilkes Booth. Or when they killed Kennedy, all they're going to talk about is Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone gunman, the lone terrorist. It's much, much deeper in all of those. And every one of those things I mentioned, you can trace back to the Jesuit order as well. Now, here's the deal. The gunpowder plot. They tried to blow up Parliament to get control for the Pope of the Holy Roman Empire, as they were losing power in London and in England. And so they devised a plot to blow up Parliament. It was foiled, but a lot of things came out showing who was responsible. Just like we showed the Vatican was responsible in the killing of Abraham Lincoln, as well as harboring one of the gang that was trying to kill Lincoln and others in his cabinet, who was then one fled, others were hung. You don't hear about that either, do you? And one fled. He was hid out in a church in Canada. Then they sent him to the Vatican, where he was posing as a papal guard. When our patriots back then got wind of it, they sent ships there to get him. The Vatican basically said he escaped. They caught him in Egypt, and everybody knew the Vatican was involved in this. So what happened? Our government decided to break off diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Good reason. And but that didn't stop them. They were busy here throughout the whole period of time, still working undercover. And look where they are today. How many dioceses, how many churches. Look at the craziness they've done here with all of their crazy. They get involved in creating the Federal Reserve System, taking us off the gold standard. They get involved with pedophilia, rampant in our educational system. They're a destructive force, and they've never left. But, on the surface, our politicians back then cut them off. Reagan instituted them again. That's one reason why I found it so ironic that I ended up in Italy, because I hated Ronald Reagan back then. Like I said yesterday, I was basically, I didn't understand the Hegelian dialectic back then, and so I was more of a liberal journalist, and I didn't like Reagan at all. But anyway, I found out the truth about him when I went to Rome, and like I said, how ironic, I almost got killed because of him. I should have stayed in the States. He should have. But anyway, so there we have, go back now, instead of talking about ISIS, the gunpowder plot. Okay, huge in history, but do you think you're taught the truth about any of that stuff in American history? When I was in college, no, they don't want you to know any of this. So the other day, I had gunpowder plot on my mind. And like I do a lot of times, I spend time walking my dog in a very beautiful park. and I meet a lot of people. So I decided to say, hey, and I kind of do it, we're talking about maybe the Chicago Cubs, and then I'll say, hey, do you know what the gunpowder plot is? And do you know, I asked maybe 8 to 10 people, and I got some really strange answers. One said it was from a Bonanza show and the Cartwrights. Another said John Wayne made a movie called The Gunpowder Plot. Another one said, oh, yes, the Gunpowder Plot. Wasn't that where, this crazy guy tried to blow Parliament? So I did get one guy knowing that, but he didn't know anything else about it. So I get all these crazy, answers, regarding it's on Bonanza. That was a show on Bonanza. So, God, where are we at in this country? But when we really start looking at the gunpowder plot, we'll see Jesuit terrorism and where it comes from and who is still doing it today and why they are so involved in our political system, our foreign affairs. They're very good at this stuff. And so they're doing it today. So anyway, I thought what I would do, despite construction going on near here, near the studio, you can probably hear a little bit, I thought I would play a short clip on the gunpowder plot, maybe 2. And this is called Gunpowder Plot Part 1, Roman Catholic Jesuit Conspiracy, Hidden from the People. And there's a comment here I should read. It said, it's pretty good. It says, if you want to end wars, you need to first expose the real terrorists. And without false flag ops like the 1605 gunpowder plot, most wars would be hard to launch. They're not just coincidences. Is it a coincidence or are there coincidences? Is it plural or just singular? Think of the unprecedented millions of peace marchers who took to the streets prior to the invasion of Iraq. If the deceptions are used to justify such wars were exposed earlier by skeptical, independent, ferociously investigative media, we would be living in a different world. Millions of horrible deaths and all the accompanying grief could have been avoided. And the military, but the Jesuits, folks, they do not want to avoid that. And the military would have to put on a bake sale to raise funds. Both 9/11 and Guy Fawkes in 1605 were false flag operations designed to start wars by the governments, not by the scapegoat terrorists. If you want to end wars, you need to first expose the real terrorists. Please inform your friends. Okay, we're doing that. And we're going all the way back to the Jesuits here again. As they, people used to laugh at me 10, 15 years ago, and they'd say, "Oh, you see a Jesuit behind every rock." Well, I think you're starting to see that that statement is true. So anyway, let's get to this clip on the gunpowder plot. Here we go.
These are the Houses of Parliament today. They form the most recognisable government buildings in the world. And this is what they look like in 1605. Guy Fawkes is the name we associate most closely with the plot. When, at about midnight on the 4th of November 1605, a search party discovered him, lurking in the vaults beneath the House of Lords. He was just hours away from blowing apart the very fabric of the English state.
What is your name?
18 months of meticulous planning and deception were foiled by this arrest.
What are the names of your accomplices in this terrible endeavour?
Well, of course, this is only the beginning as far as the government are concerned. They know nothing apart from the fact that they've caught this stranger standing guard over nearly a ton of gunpowder.
Take him away.
But who are his associates? Who is he linked to? Start, Fawkes isn't saying anything. Indeed, when he's dragged before the sleepy king on the morning of the 5th of November and the king asks him why on earth he should have done such a thing, Fawkes says I wanted to blow you back to your Scottish mountains.
So why did Guy Fawkes want to blow the king back to his Scottish mountains? While writing a book exploring the religious backdrop to the Gunpowder Plot, I looked at this question again and again, but what soon became clear was that, despite his popular association with the plot, the answer to it didn't lie with Fawkes. He is not the key to this story.
The ringleader of the plot was Robert Catesby, not Guy Fawkes, although Guy Fawkes has got lumbered with it. He's got lumbered with being burnt on November the 5th. I don't think we can really understand the plot unless we understand Catesby. People adored him. He was one of those men people would follow to death.
There's a charisma to Catesby. There's, if you like, a black glamour to the man. He is a mix of a very devoted Catholic, at the same time a man whose purpose in this particular plot is revenge.
There were 5 core plotters: Catesby, Fawkes, and 3 others. There, Catesby outlined to them his plans for the most daring terrorist attempt this country has ever seen. But what was it that had brought the 5 men together? What had driven them to devise such a devastating atrocity?
Looking at the Gunpowder Plot and the issues that created it, we should go back at least 30 to 35 years to about a dozen years into Queen Elizabeth's reign, when the Pope excommunicated her and called upon all loyal Catholics to depose her. And it was also said in certain circles to assassinate her. And what this did was it politicised religion in England.
Which one of us has not lost money? Fawkes, you have bled for your faith.
Recusants had to pay fines every time they failed to attend Sunday service. And of course, as the paranoia about Catholics increased, those fines became steeper and steeper.
But in the eyes of the government, an even greater threat to the state was posed by a new order of radical Catholic priests called the Jesuits. English Jesuits, trained in Europe and smuggled home in secret, were now operating illicitly across the country in an effort to keep the Catholic faith alive.
The Jesuits were the symbol of everything that was powerful and sinister about Roman Catholicism. That was, in a sense, unfair, because the society had started as a way of evangelizing Europe, of bringing the good news to Europe. But very quickly, it acquired the edge of attacking Protestants. And from the outside, it would look like a terrorist organization such as Al-Qaeda, which, of course, simply means network. The Jesuits were a network. So to be a Protestant and look at this would be a very scary experience.
Okay, yes, a very scary experience. And basically the deception, the presentation of the Jesuits, how they present themselves, what is all false. Their main goal was to kill Protestants and to bring power to the papacy. They infiltrated England. They infiltrated our country. They're doing the same thing today. And this idea that they are just a network of evangelists is totally false. That's their cover. And so we'll continue in the second half hour with a look at the Gunpowder Plot. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, back for the second half hour. We're going to continue with this presentation of the Gunpowder Plot, Roman Catholic Jesuit Conspiracy. But one thought on this. Over the years, I've read a number of books, watched countless videos and presentations on this, and getting both sides of the story. I mean, the Catholic side of the story, the Roman Catholic view of the story, the Jesuit view, contradicts a lot of what we're talking about here. There's kind of a medium or a what would you say, a lukewarm approach, and then the real story where we find the direct connection to the Jesuits. So, you know, just as you're taught, I don't know how many of you understand when you get into a legal case, what you try to do is understand what the other side is going to present. Know all of their evidence and their story. You got to know in this case, just using it as if it was a legal case, you got to know the Vatican side of the story better than your own story if you're trying to prove a point. And that's where a lot of people go wrong, because they're afraid to look at that. You know, I used to say years ago, I said, to understand the occult, you got to know what the occult, how they think. And so I've read a lot about them, spend hours and days reading into their occult system, their numerology, all of their different crazy ideas, but they aren't crazy to them. And to know your enemy is to, in a sense, defeat your enemy. And so when you read the Gunpowder Plot, check out all sides of the story, and that way you will come to a rational, sensible, common sense conclusion. And I think that'll serve you well. Well, here we go. Back to the Gunpowder Plot.
The plan is terrifying in its simplicity. It is to blow up the king, the king's nearest relations, the entire nobility, the political nation, gathered together at the state opening of Parliament. In May 1604, they actually come up with the means to put this plan into effect. A house adjacent to the old House of Lords has fallen vacant. The lease has fallen vacant.
It was Thomas Percy, newly appointed to the King's bodyguards, who secured the lease on the apartment. To avoid arousing suspicion, Guy Fawkes now took up residency under the alias of John Johnson, passing himself off as Percy's servant.
Because he had been out of the country for 10 years, he was unknown in the small world that was Jacobean London. And that's always important. If you're planning treason, you need someone who can walk about the streets without arousing attention or suspicion.
The idea of Guy Fawkes, alias John Johnson, unknown, coming into the extremely busy Palace of Westminster. I mean, we're so used to the Palace of Westminster having security and needing security. We have no idea. It was like a sort of commercial rabbit warren, merchants and wine cellars and all the rest of it.
Early Jacobean England was crawling with spies on the lookout for any Catholic who might be a threat to the king. The spy master in charge of the operation was Sir Robert Cecil, Secretary of State and King James's chief minister.
He's a workaholic. He has virtually no life except for his professional life. And he'd already had long service under Elizabeth, so here's a very experienced senior bureaucrat. And across Cecil's desk comes a tremendous miscellaneous range of information. You get what the modern mind recognises immediately as the nutter letter, and he gets a lot of those. But he also gets anything that might be regarded as unnerving or unsettling. And there's all sorts of bits and pieces that he's getting about increasing Catholic disaffection. Much of it wrong in detail, but adding up to a feeling that something is moving somewhere.
The plotters were working towards a deadline of February 1605, the date set for the state opening of Parliament. But then, circumstances changed when Parliament was prorogued, postponed for 8 months.
There was always plague in London, and when the plague was virulent, it wasn't thought a good plan to have a meeting of Parliament. So Parliament, who should have met earlier in the year, was prorogued till October. We should be chanting "Remember, remember the 3rd of October." Now, on the one hand, this gave the plotters much more time to organise things. On the other hand, of course, as with all conspiracies, the longer lead time there is, the more the danger of people finding out.
Okay, we're going to get back to this in just 1 second. I did want to add some things. And let me get my bearings here. What, the Jesuits, when they work, they choose people that work for them, that are going to take the fall for them. And it's kind of like the way the mafia operates. It's hard to get to the mafia boss, right? But doing due diligence in your homework, you will make that connection. And many, many researchers have connected this to the Jesuit order. So do you think they're doing the same thing today? Have they changed when we understand what they really did during the American Revolution, and we trace their history? So going back to the gunpowder plot, when people came here in the 1600s, they had an understanding of this organization and what they were trying to do in England and in other parts of Europe, and they wanted to get away from it. And in fact, I was reading memoirs of the first people, that came here, Christians that came here, and they were even on the ships coming over, they were looking for Jesuit spies, and they realized how important it was to keep them out. That's why when you look at what they did here to get in, it's a fascinating story, and if we follow it now in 2017, when I say that, I kind of go, is it really that 2017? When we look at it and see how they've progressed, more control, more deception, the same scenarios going on today as was going on in 1605. So let's get back to it. This is part 2 of the gunpowder plot, done by a group called Bible or Traditions.
With forks installed close to the House of Lords, attention now turned towards the gunpowder. Catesby had lodgings in Lambeth, directly across the river from the Houses of Parliament. As the plotters began to source the gunpowder, it was stored piecemeal in Catesby's house. But then an opportunity arose that would take the plotters even closer to their target.
And Fawkes reports that a coal merchant is moving out of a vault actually under the Lords. So, Percy takes up the lease of the vault as well.
Percy's cover story for renting the storeroom was that his wife was about to join him in London, and he would therefore need extra storage space.
The famous cellar in which Guy Fawkes placed all the gunpowder was actually not a cellar at all. It was on the ground floor. It was pretty ramshackle, so it was a rather good choice.
But how would the gunpowder be smuggled into the House of Lords?
We're here in Lambeth, on the south bank of the river, just across from the Houses of Parliament. It was here that Robert Catesby had his lodgings, and from here that the gunpowder was rowed over the river. If you think of the Thames then, alive with trade and traffic, one more small boat going back and forth would never have been noticed.
And they focus on stockpiling gunpowder in the vault.
Storing all the gunpowder here. It's very interesting.
By July 1605, after many trips to and fro from Lambeth, a total of 36 barrels of gunpowder had been amassed.
Effectively, with the gunpowder in the vault, everything is ready.
But this strike at the heart of government would have gone much deeper. The terrorist attack on the state opening of Parliament would have killed the king and also created a political vacuum.
69 very senior men would be there, plus in attendance all the senior 12 judges of England and their legal attendants. So you would have had the majority of the bishops of the Church of England, the members of the Privy Council, the majority of the English aristocracy, and the whole of the leaders of the legal system. So you would have had a very, very substantial number of the political and landowning elite of England immediately wiped out.
The king would have been seated here, in the centre of the House of Lords. Directly below the chamber were the 36 barrels of gunpowder amassed by the plotters. In today's House of Lords, the space where the gunpowder was stored forms part of a maintenance workshop on the lower ground level. 400 years ago on this site, the guards would have seen a surprisingly large quantity of firewood here, on this spot. Their suspicions were further aroused when it was discovered that Thomas Percy had leased the space. He was a suspected Catholic agitator. When this news reached King James, he immediately ordered a second search of the area by his guards.
It's interesting to see how these people are used by the Jesuit order, isn't it?
And they encounter Fawkes emerging from the vault, dressed, booted and spurred. And because he is dressed strangely for such an hour, they arrest him and they find the gunpowder.
The great explosion had been averted.
But who was behind it is the question.
There are many estimates of how much gunpowder was there. It's said to be 36 barrels, and that could be anywhere from 1 to 3 tons of gunpowder.
What if it went off?
Even 1 ton would have been complete overkill if what you wanted to do was to kill the people in the room above. It would actually burn in a fraction of a second and turn to heat and gas. And that heat and gas then would try to expand. The room being 400 cubic metres, this gas would try to expand into 4,000 cubic metres. What that will do is put pressure on the walls, but they're 9 feet thick. The weakest part of that room is the ceiling. And when that breached, it would be thrown upwards with huge force, and anyone above it would have been killed instantly.
Well, that brings to mind when they orchestrated this terror attack at the newspaper that I walked through. There's a long hallway leading up to a reception area, and I opened the door like I always did. And to the left was a doorway going to the basement of the newsroom, and to the right was the publisher's office. Well, they had put 2 kilos of dynamite right inside by the door of the publisher's office. And that blew out that whole hallway. And what saved me were the thick walls on those old buildings. But the explosion, I was deafened for at least an hour after that huge explosion. And reminded me how they really haven't changed, have they? Back to the gunpowder plot.
On the evening of November the 5th, Catesby and his men arrived at a drinking house in Warwickshire to meet with a party of Catholics they hoped would join them in rebellion.
And at the Red Lion Dunchurch, they give the news to the assembled Catholic gentry. They don't take it at all well. Most of them vanish as fast as they can into the night. They don't want any part in treason, in rebellion against the king. They don't necessarily believe Catesby. For once, his charisma lets him down. They move on to secure Catholic houses in the Midlands, hoping all the while to drum up support, but all the while losing support.
As Catesby continued his desperate flight north, Guy Fawkes was facing up to his captors. But in these early stages, Fawkes was giving nothing away. For 24 hours, Guy Fawkes had held out, maintaining his false identity and refusing to name his accomplices. So on the 6th of November, he was brought here, to the Tower of London and to the Lieutenant's lodgings, now called the Queen's House. But still he refused to talk. Even the King was impressed by his self-control, but his captors were after nothing less than a full confession. Though torture in England was technically illegal, its use was permitted under exceptional circumstances. And by now, King James was losing patience. He wrote this letter authorizing the use of torture against Fawkes.
If he will not otherwise confess, the gentler tortures are to be first used unto him, and so by degrees, until the ultimate is reached. And so God speed your good work. James.
Of all the forms of torture then in existence, the rack was said to be the worst. It seems there was only one in England, kept here in the Tower of London. On the 6th of November, King James signed the warrant putting Guy Fawkes to the torture, and all the evidence suggests it was to the rack he was brought. By the 7th of November, he'd revealed his true identity. 2 days later, he'd revealed everything else. His suffering can be charted in his signature. The last was that of a broken man. This is Coton Court in Warwickshire, home of Robert Catesby's mother and another of the Midlands Catholic strongholds. It was here that Father Garnet and his fellow priests were waiting anxiously for news of the plot. On the 6th of November, Catesby's servant rode into the courtyard here, bringing a letter from Catesby, revealing the details of the plot and containing the devastating news that the plot had failed. Catesby begged Father Henry Garnet to raise a Catholic rebellion. Hearing this, Garnet was reported to have cried, "We are all utterly undone." This was the last thing Father Garnet wanted.
Okay, I hope that helped you understand really how they use people, how they orchestrate these terrorist attacks. They're never going to take the fall, are they? But they were behind it, just like they were behind. The similar facts showed the Jesuits behind the killing of Abraham Lincoln. I got about 5 minutes, so let me explain something here. Did anybody ever see the movie V for Vendetta and the mask? The V mask that's worn? And it's very interesting that we're seeing this V for Vendetta mask appear all over the place now. We're seeing it on protesters wear this mask at Occupy rallies. We're seeing it on websites. We're seeing people that Anonymous comes out on websites now talking about power back to the people. It's appearing on websites and supposedly standing up against and exposing the New World Order. But I think it's doing just the opposite. So it's a sign of revolution, and there are revolutions rising up all over the world today. But let's talk about the masters of deception. And the world, folks, is really ripe now for Satan's final deception. But look at this. Now, just as we talk about the gunpowder plot, a vast majority of people, like I told you when I went out and asked people in the park, what's the gunpowder plot? And somebody said it was a show on Bonanza. It was one of their shows they played on Bonanza. The gunpowder plot of 1605, led by Guy Fawkes, and the others that presentation talked about, was a Jesuit plan to not only destroy the Protestant government of England, but to kill King James. Why? Well, the Jesuits are hell-bent on bringing global supremacy to the Roman Catholic Church. And wherever Protestants stand in the way, even today, the Jesuits will infiltrate, will take over, will do anything. They have no problem with destroying Protestantism in order to further the Roman Catholic Babylon's mission. But why specifically King James? Well, One great thing did God do through King James. Well, he inspired the King James Bible. That was first published in 1611. The aim of the Jesuits has always been to stop the intercession of God through the Bible so people can find God through His Word, and they don't need Roman Catholicism or the Pope. And Satan wants to stop this, wants to stop the masses from really understanding what God is all about. It boils down to a war between God and Satan, isn't it? And I wouldn't have known that 20 years, 30 years ago when I was almost killed in one of these plots, but the same thing's going on today. And these groups that are being funded by George Soros now we see in our country, and all of these different protest groups really are playing into the hand of Satan. And you have to get to the bottom of this. And I think what you're seeing, just check out how they're using Guy Fawkes and the V for Vendetta mask. And I wonder, did you ever see that movie? It's worth watching. If you understand what's really going on behind the scenes, because the Roman Catholic Jesuits have used revolutions and wars throughout the course of history to push their own agendas. They're doing the same thing today. And their goal is to form unity under Satan, unity with the beast, and to direct everyone away from the Bible. And that's why you're seeing even Christian persecutions here in our country. You're seeing it all over in the Middle East, the Vatican using Islam and the Muslim faith to kill Christianity. You see it here, the infiltration of Protestant churches. You see it in the destruction, the attempted destruction of the Tony Alamo ministry, who tried to bring a lot of these truths to the forefront of the people in America. But ask yourself this, how many people in this country do you think really understand this or will even take the time? Don't give up. Pass it around, pass this show around, and one by one, we can maybe pull a few people away from this Jesuit plot to destroy this country. Back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.